My name is Miriam Asante, and I am 36 years old, and I am sitting in an office on the 14th floor of a building that I helped design. And I am looking out at a city that does not know my name yet, and my assistant has just knocked on my door and told me that there is an elderly man at the reception desk who does not have an appointment and who has been standing there for 20 minutes, and who gave his name when asked, and the name he gave is the name of my father, and I have not heard that name spoken aloud in this building before, and I have not spoken to the man it belongs to in 20 years. And I want to tell you about the morning that made the distance between that sentence and this one. And I want to tell you about it carefully, because it deserves to be told carefully, and because the details matter in the way that the details of foundations always matter, which is that you cannot understand what stands on top of them without understanding what they are made of. It was a Saturday in October. I was 16 years old, and the morning was the specific cold of early October in the north of England, which is not the full cold of winter, but is the cold that arrives as a warning. And I had woken at 7 because I always woke at 7. And I had dressed and I had gone downstairs, and my mother was standing in the kitchen. And she had the expression she wore when she had decided something and was waiting for the right moment to deliver it. And she said my name, and she said that she needed me to come to the hallway. My bag was already there. It was the blue canvas bag I used for school, and it had been packed by someone other than me, because the way the clothes were folded was not the way I folded clothes. And it was sitting by the front door next to my coat. And I looked at it, and I looked at my mother, and I looked at my father, who was standing at the bottom of the stairs, and who was looking at his shoes with the concentration of a man who has decided that the floor is the most important thing in the room. My mother said that they had been thinking carefully and that the situation in the house had become difficult and that my sister needed more space and that Naomi was at a sensitive age and that the bedroom situation was not sustainable and that I had always been the capable one and the tough one and the independent one and that she and my father had discussed it and that they felt I would manage and that young people were resilient and that she had spoken to a woman at a church who knew of a shelter in the next town that was clean and well run, and that she had written the address on a piece of paper which was in the bag. Then she held out her hand. In her hand was a 20-pound note and a bus ticket. The bus ticket was for the 10:15 to Harrowfield, which was the next town, and the 20-pound note was folded once. And she held them both out toward me, and I looked at them, and I looked at her face, and I looked at my father's shoes, and I took the 20 pounds and the bus ticket, and I put them in my coat pocket. I did not cry. I want to be clear about that, because I think it matters, and I did not cry, and I did not shout, and I did not ask my father to look up from the floor, and I did not ask my mother whether she understood what she was doing, and I did not say any of the things that were present in the room, because none of those things would have changed the bag by the door or the bus ticket in my pocket, and I understood at 16 in the way that some people understand things at 16, which is completely and without any remaining room for doubt that nothing I said in that hallway was going to matter, and that the only thing that was going to matter was everything that came after it. I picked up the bag, I picked up my coat, I opened the front door, and I stepped out onto the pavement. And the October air was cold. And I stood on the pavement outside the house I had grown up in, and I looked at the street, which was quiet and ordinary and completely indifferent. And I put my hand in my pocket, and I felt the 20-pound note and the bus ticket. And I stood there for a moment, and I made a decision, and the decision was not dramatic, and did not feel significant in the moment, and was simply a quiet and complete commitment that I made to myself on a cold pavement at 7:15 on a Saturday morning, which was that I was going to build something so far beyond what they could imagine that when they finally understood what they had put on that bus, they would have to live inside that understanding for the rest of their lives. I walked to the bus stop. I did not look back at the house. The 10:15 came on time, and I got on, and I found a seat by the window, and I watched the town I had grown up in move past the glass and then disappear. And I did not feel the things I had expected to feel, which were grief and fear, and I felt instead a cold and specific clarity that I have felt at important moments since, and that I have come to understand is the feeling I get when a decision has been made completely, and there is nothing left to do but execute it. The shelter in Harrow Field was clean. As my mother had said, I stayed there for 11 weeks. In those 11 weeks, I worked 3 jobs, all of them cash in hand, and all of them taken without complaint and without the luxury of preference. And I washed dishes, and I cleaned offices at 5 in the morning, and I stacked shelves, and I came back to the shelter each night, and I sat on the bed in the shared room, and I studied, because I had taken my school books, and my mother had not thought to remove them from the blue canvas bag when she packed it, which was the single most useful thing she ever did for me. I studied for 2 years. Then I worked for 3, then I studied again, and then I built, and 20 years after a Saturday in October, I am sitting on the 14th floor of a building in a city that is learning my name. And my assistant is standing in the doorway waiting for an answer. And I look at her and I think about a 20-pound note folded once. And I think about a bus ticket. And I think about a man looking at his shoes. I tell her to send him up. I want to tell you about the 2 minutes between telling my assistant to send him up and the moment the lift doors opened, because those 2 minutes were not empty and were not wasted. And I spent them doing what I always do when something significant is about to happen, which is sitting very still and thinking about the structure of the situation and what it required of me and what I was willing to give it. And by the time the lift doors opened, I had made the necessary decisions and arranged my face and my hands and my posture in the way I arrange them when I need the room to understand who it is dealing with. Before anyone says a word, the lift doors opened and my father walked out. I had not seen him in 20 years, and I want to tell you what 20 years does to a person who was already not young when they spent them. And what it had done to my father was this, which was that it had taken the particular quality of physical authority he had always carried, which was the authority of a man who fills a room without trying, and had replaced it with something smaller and more careful. And he walked across the office floor toward my desk with the walk of a person who is no longer certain that the ground will hold, and he was wearing a coat that had been good once, and his hair was entirely white, and his hands, when I looked at them, were the hands of a man who had not been well. For some time he stopped in front of my desk. He looked at me, and I watched the moment when he understood who he was looking at, and the understanding moved across his face. In stages, the way understanding always moves, when it is arriving at something the mind has not prepared for. And he said my name, and the name he said was the name he had given me when I was born. And hearing it in his voice, in this room, on this floor, in this city, after 20 years, was a stranger experience than I had anticipated, and I noted that. And I set it aside. His eyes were wet. He said my name again. And then he said that they had been looking for me, and that they had not known where I was, and that they had tried, and I want to tell you that I listened to this without changing my expression, because I had spent 20 years becoming someone who does not change her expression when she hears something that is not true, And what my father said about looking for me and trying was not true. And I knew it was not true because in the first 3 years, after the Saturday in October, I had been findable and had not been difficult to find, and had been working in visible places and living in places with addresses. And no one had come, and no letter had arrived, and the looking he was describing had not happened, and we both knew it. And the knowing sat between us in the office like a third presence that neither of us was going to acknowledge directly. I asked him to sit down. He sat. He said that he was not well. And the way he said it told me that not well was doing a great deal of work in that sentence. And I asked him to be specific, and he was specific, and what he described was a condition that I will not name here, but that I knew well enough, because I had been adjacent to the medical world for long enough to understand what the name meant and what the treatment required and what the treatment cost, and I listened to all of it without speaking. And when he finished, I said nothing for a moment, and the office was quiet and the city was visible through the glass behind me, and my father sat across the desk from me, looking at his hands, which was the same thing he had been looking at on the Saturday in October. And I noted that, too, he said that the treatment was only available privately and that the private facility that specialized in his condition was not something they could fund. And he said that they had nothing left, and he said the word nothing with the specific emphasis of a person who needs you to understand that the word is being used precisely and not figuratively. And he said that he and my mother were asking for help, and that he knew he had no right to ask, and that he was asking anyway because I was their daughter, and they were my family. And family was the only thing that mattered. In the end, I said nothing for a long moment. Then I asked about Naomi. I said the name of my sister. The way you say a name that has lived in your mouth for 20 years, without being spoken, which is carefully and with full awareness of what it contains. And my father looked at me when I said it, and his face did something complicated, and he said that Naomi had not managed well, and that she had made decisions that had consequences, and that she was not in contact with them at the moment. And I said that I understood, and I did understand, because the architecture of what he was describing was not difficult to read, which was that the sister for whom a bedroom had been considered worth more than a daughter had consumed what the parents had built and had left when the consumption was complete. And I sat with that for a moment, and I said nothing about it. I stood up, I walked to the window. I looked down at the complex below, and the complex below my building is a private medical facility that occupies 3 floors of the building adjacent to mine. And it is connected to my building by a covered walkway on the 2nd floor. And it has a reputation in this city that has been built over 7 years. And its name is visible from where my father was sitting, and I looked down at it for a long moment, and then I said that I knew that hospital very well. My father followed my gaze. He looked at the building, and he looked at the name, and he looked back at me. I turned from the window. I said that I would consider what he had asked, and that consideration required one thing from him, which was that he bring my mother to this office tomorrow morning at 9, and that the 3 of us would sit in this room and have the conversation that we had not had on a Saturday in October 20 years ago, and that if he did that, I would tell him what I had decided. He said he would bring her. I said good. I walked back to my desk, and I sat down, and I opened the file I had been working on before my assistant knocked, and I looked at it, and I said that my assistant would show him out. He stood. He looked at me for a moment. He said thank you. I did not look up from the file. At 8:58, I was sitting at my desk with my hands flat on the surface in front of me and a folder to my right and a cup of tea to my left. And the city was doing what it does at that hour, which is moving with the specific purposeful energy of people who have somewhere to be. and I was watching the lift, and at 9 exactly the doors opened, and my father walked out first, and my mother walked out behind him, and I watched her come through the doors of my office for the first time, and I watched her see it. I want to tell you about what it looked like to watch my mother see my office, because I think it is one of the most precise things I have ever observed, and what happened was not a single reaction, and was a sequence of them that moved across her face in the order in which the information arrived. And the first reaction was the scale of the space, which is large and glass-walled and looks out over the city on two sides. And the second reaction was the quality of what was in it, which is not expensive in the way that things are expensive when someone wants you to know they are expensive, but expensive in the way that things are expensive. When the person who chose them was thinking about function and permanence and not about impression. And the third reaction was the desk. And I was behind the desk, and I watched her understand that the person behind it was her daughter. And I watched her try to reconcile the person she had put on a bus with the person she was looking at. And I watched her fail to do it quickly and have to keep looking. She crossed the room toward me with her arms open and her face arranged in the expression of a woman arriving at a reunion. And she said, "My beautiful girl." And she said they had missed me, and she was moving with the momentum of a person who has decided the embrace is already happening. I did not stand up. I said, "Sit down." 2 words, and the momentum stopped, and she stood in the middle of my office with her arms still slightly open, and my father put his hand on her arm, and they sat. And I looked at them across the desk, and I opened the folder, and I said that before anything else was said, I wanted them to look at 3 documents. The first document was a bank statement showing their current account balance, which my research team had located through public debt registry filings. And the balance was not a number that supported the lifestyle my mother was wearing, which was a coat I recognized as expensive and shoes that were recent. And I said that I found it interesting that people who had come to ask for help with a medical procedure that cost more than most people earned in a year were dressed in a way that suggested the poverty was selective. My mother said that appearances mattered and that they still had their dignity. I said that I remembered when their dignity had been worth more than their daughter. She looked at me. I said that the second document was a land registry record, and I turned it toward them, and it showed that the family home which they had owned outright for 30 years had been remortgaged twice in the previous decade, and that the second remortgage had been taken out 4 years ago, and that the payments had stopped 14 months ago, and that the property was currently in a pre-repossession status. And I said that I found it interesting that neither of them had mentioned this when my father sat in this office yesterday and described their situation as simply having nothing left. My father said that things had become complicated. I said that fraud generally did. My mother's face changed. I said that the third document was a statement from a financial services company showing a loan taken out 6 years ago in my father's name and guaranteed by my mother, and that the loan had been used to fund a business registered to Naomi, and that the business had dissolved after 11 months, and that the loan remained outstanding, and that the outstanding amount with interest was significant, and that this was the specific mechanism by which they had arrived at the position they were currently in, which was sitting across from the daughter they had given a 20-pound note and a bus ticket, asking her to solve a problem that her sister had created and that they had enabled. The room was quiet. My mother said that I did not understand what Naomi had put them through. I said that I understood exactly what it felt like to be failed by the people who were supposed to protect you. And I said it without raising my voice and without any particular emphasis. And I watched those words land in the room, and I watched my mother receive them. and I watched her understand that there was no version of this conversation in which she was the person who had been most wronged. She said that they were still my parents. I said that parenthood was a set of actions, and not only a biological fact, and that the actions associated with their parenthood of me had concluded on a pavement in October 20 years ago, and that what they were asking me to engage with now was not a parental relationship, but a transaction, and that I was willing to consider the transaction on its own terms. My father said quietly that he was afraid, and I want to tell you that those 3 words were the first true thing that had been said in the room, and I heard them, and I noted them, and I did not let them move me from the position I was in, because I had not built what I had built by allowing true things to move me before I had finished thinking about them. I stood up. I walked to the window. I looked at the medical facility in the adjacent building, and I looked at the covered walkway, and I looked at the name above the entrance, which my parents could read from where they were sitting, and I turned to face them. I said that my connection to that hospital was not what they thought it was, and that tomorrow I would show them exactly what it was, and that what I was going to show them would answer the question of whether I was going to help my father, and would also answer a question they had not thought to ask. Yet which was what 20 years of a 20-pound note and a bus ticket had actually produced. I said the same time tomorrow I walked back to my desk. I sat down, I looked at the folder. I did not look up again until I heard the lift doors close. I let the silence after the lift doors closed do its work for the rest of that day. And I want to tell you that I did not spend the evening thinking about my parents, or about the conversation that had happened in my office, or about my father's face when he said he was afraid. And I spent the evening doing what I always do in the hours before something significant, which is working. And the work I did that evening was not related to my parents, and was the ordinary detailed work of running a company that has obligations and timelines and people depending on the quality of my attention, and I gave it my full attention, and I went to bed at 11, and I slept well, and I woke at 6, and I made my tea, and I sat at the kitchen table in my flat, which is on the 19th floor of a building 2 streets from the office, and I looked at the city waking up below me, and I thought about what I was going to say, and in what order. And I went to the office at 8, and I was ready. They arrived at 9. Again, they were more subdued than the previous morning, and I noticed that my mother had not worn the expensive coat, and had worn instead something older and more considered, and I understood that she had thought about what I had said about appearances, and had made an adjustment, and I noted the adjustment, and I noted that it was the kind of adjustment that is made to manage a situation, and not the kind that is made because something has been understood, and there is a difference between those 2 kinds of adjustment, and it matters. I asked them to sit. They sat. I stood at the window for a moment, and I looked at the medical facility, and I thought about the first time I had stood in that building, which was 4 years ago, and the building had been something else at that point, and was in the early stages of a conversion. And I had been brought there by an architect I was working with on a separate project, and she had shown me the plans, and I had stood in the shell of what it was going to become, and I had understood immediately what it needed to be and what it could be worth. And I had made 3 calls before I left the building that afternoon. And the calls had set in motion the process that had produced the facility that my parents were looking at through my office window. I turned around. I sat down. I opened the folder, and I said that I wanted to tell them about how I had spent the 20 years between the bus ticket and this office, and I said that I was not going to tell them about the shelter or the cash in hand jobs or the years of studying, because those years were mine, and I did not owe them the details of what their decision had cost me to survive. And I said that what I was going to tell them about was the structure I had built, because the structure was relevant to the conversation we were having, and they needed to understand it. Before we could proceed, I said that I had started with property. I said that I had understood from the beginning that property was the only asset class that rewarded patience absolutely and without exception. And that patience was the one thing I had in quantities that other people did not. Because I had learned patience on a pavement at 16 and had been practicing it ever since. And I said that I had bought my first property at 23 with a deposit that had taken me 4 years to save, and that I had bought the second 18 months later, and that the portfolio had grown in the way that portfolios grow when the person managing them does not make decisions based on emotion and does not sell when the market makes them afraid. And I said that the portfolio now included 47 properties across 6 cities, and that the most recent acquisition was not a residential property and was not a commercial property. In the conventional sense, I opened the folder to the third document. I turned it to face them. It was an acquisition summary, and it was dated 8 months ago, and it described the purchase by my investment firm of the debt instrument secured against the medical facility in the adjacent building. And the debt instrument was the mechanism through which the facility's original development had been financed, and the acquisition of that instrument meant that my firm held the senior secured position over the entire facility, and that the facility's continued operation was contingent on terms that my firm controlled. And I said that I did not own the medical facility in the way that you own a chair or a car. And I owned it in the way that you own something, when you hold the instrument that everything else depends on, which is from the foundation. Up, my mother looked at the document. She looked at the building. She looked at me. She said that this was not about money, and that a person's life was not about money, and that my father was sick, and that I was his daughter, and that whatever I had built and whatever I owned, the fact of what I was and who had given me life did not change. And she said the word cruel, and she said it at a volume that was higher than the previous volumes she had used in this office, and her eyes were wet. And I watched her, and I let her finish, and I did not change my expression. I said that I remembered a specific conversation about love. I said that I remembered being told that the decision to put me on a bus had been made out of love for my sister, and out of the belief that I did not need what my sister needed. And I said that love had been the explanation for the 20-pound note and the bus ticket, and that I found it interesting that love was now being offered as the reason I should respond differently than they had my father said my name. I looked at him. I said that his condition was treatable, and that the facility next door had the specific expertise required, and that the treatment could be arranged through my firm's relationship with the facility, and that the cost was significant, but was not a cost that was beyond what I could absorb. And I said that I was not going to tell them today whether I was going to absorb it. I said that my decision would be communicated tomorrow. I said that the decision would not be based on the fact that they were my parents, and would not be based on love, and would be based on the same criteria I use for every decision my firm made, which were the merits of the situation, examined without sentiment, and the nature of the obligation, if any that existed between the parties. I closed the folder. I said that was all for today. My mother opened her mouth. I said that my assistant would show them out. I looked at the city through the glass. I thought about a 20-pound note, folded once I thought about what obligations actually are when you strip away the language that people use to make them feel larger than they are. I thought about tomorrow. The silence after I closed the folder had a particular quality that I have only experienced a small number of times in my professional life, And it is the silence that arrives when a room full of people has received information that has reorganized everything they thought they understood about the situation they were sitting in. And it requires a moment to settle. The way sediment requires a moment to settle after water has been disturbed. And I sat in it, and I let it settle, and I watched my parents on the other side of the desk. And what I saw was two people who had arrived in this office 3 days ago with a version of events that had felt solid to them, and who were now sitting inside the understanding that the version had been built on a foundation that had not accounted for what the person across the desk had been doing for 20 years. While they had not been looking, my mother was the first to speak, and what she said was not a sentence and was a sound. And the sound was the sound of a person who has been holding a position and has felt the position give way beneath them and does not yet know what to hold on to instead. And my father said nothing and looked at the desk. And I thought about a Saturday in October and a man looking at his shoes, and I thought that some things do not change as much as they appear to. And I stood up. I said that I wanted to show them something. I said it in the register I use when I am not making a request and am indicating a direction. And I came around the desk, and I walked to the office door, and I held it, and I waited. And after a moment they stood and they followed me. And we walked to the lift, and we rode it down to the second floor in silence. And the second floor of my building connects to the adjacent building through a covered walkway that is wide and light and looks down onto the street below, and my mother walked beside me on the walkway, and I was aware of her looking at me in the way she had been looking at me since she first walked into my office, which was the look of a person trying to read something in a language they thought they knew, and finding that the vocabulary has changed. We entered the medical facility through the walkway entrance. The facility on the inside has the quality of a place that has been designed by people who understand that the environment in which a person receives medical care affects the care itself, and it is quiet and considered, and the light is specific and intentional. And my mother looked around it as we walked through the entrance corridor, and I watched her arrive at the conclusion I had expected her to arrive at, which was that I was taking them here to begin the process of arranging my father's treatment. And I watched the relief move through her body when she arrived at that conclusion, and she said my name, and she said it with a warmth that was genuine, and she said that they had known, and that they had always believed that when it came to it, I would remember what mattered, and that duty was in my nature, and that she was grateful, and that my father was grateful, and she touched my arm as she said it. I did not stop walking. I said nothing. I led them through the main corridor of the facility and past the reception and past the consultation rooms and toward the East Wing, which is the wing that handles the specialism my father required. And the East Wing has a set of double doors. And above the double doors, there is a wall. And on the wall, there is a bronze plaque. And the plaque is large enough to be read from the distance at which I stopped walking, which was approximately 4 meters from the doors. I stopped. I turned to face them. I said that I wanted them to read the plaque. My father looked up at it. My mother looked up at it. The plaque said that the East Wing had been funded in its entirety by a charitable donation made 7 years ago, and that the donation had been made in the name of a foundation, and the foundation's name was the Rose Asante Foundation for Medical Access. And beneath the foundation's name, the plaque listed the trustees. And there was one trustee listed, and the name of the trustee was mine. My mother read my name on the plaque. She read it the way you read something when you are not certain that you are reading it correctly, and she read it again. And I watched her understand what she was reading. And I watched my father understand it beside her. And the corridor was quiet around us. And the facility continued its work in the rooms beyond the double doors. And the plaque said what it said in bronze letters. that did not change, regardless of who was reading them. I said that my grandmother Rose had died when I was 26 years old. I said that she had died in a care facility in the town I had grown up in, and that she had died without significant assets because the significant assets had been consumed by the people around her over the years, and that she had left me nothing because there was nothing left to leave, and that I had been at her bedside when she died, because I had found her 3 years after the Saturday in October, and had visited her every month for the 3 years between finding her and losing her, and that my parents had not been at the bedside, and that my sister had not been at the bedside, and that it had been the two of us in that room, and that she had held my hand, and that she had said one thing to me before she stopped being able to speak, and what she had said was that she was sorry for what the family had done and that she believed I was going to be all right. I said that I had established the foundation the year after she died. I said that the foundation's purpose was to fund access to specialist medical treatment for people who could not otherwise afford it, and that the East Wing had been the foundation's largest single project, and that it had been named for her because the naming was the only thing I had to give her. And I had given it. I said that my father's treatment would be approved through the foundation. I said that the approval was not because they were my parents, and was not because I had forgiven them, and was not because the conversation we had been having in my office had produced in me any feeling that could be described as familial obligation. And I said that the approval was because my grandmother had asked me with her hand in mine to be all right. And I had spent 20 years learning that being all right required being the kind of person who did not allow the cruelty of others to determine the quality of her own decisions, and that funding this treatment was consistent with who I had chosen to be. And denying it would give their cruelty a power over me that I was not willing to give it. I said that the foundation would be in contact with the facility directly. I said that they did not need to do anything further. I turned. I walked back toward the covered walkway behind me. The corridor was silent. I did not wait for them to speak, and I did not look back at the plaque, and I did not look back at my parents standing beneath my grandmother's name and my name in bronze letters in a wing that existed because a 16-year-old girl had gotten on a bus with 20 pounds and had decided somewhere between that town and this city that the only way to make the distance mean something was to build something at the other end of it that was larger than the thing she had left behind. I walked back across the covered walkway. I looked down at the street below. The city was doing what it always does, which is continuing. I went back to work. 6 months is not a long time in the life of a company, and is not a long time in the life of a city, and is a very specific amount of time in the life of a person who has been waiting for something to finish, so that she can confirm that it has finished and move forward from the place where the waiting happened. And I want to tell you that the 6 months between the morning I walked back across the covered walkway and the morning the letter arrived were not 6 months of thinking about my parents, and were not 6 months of processing or grieving or reconsidering, and were 6 months of work. And the work was the same work it had always been, which was detailed and demanding and absorbing in the way that only work you have chosen entirely for yourself can be absorbing. And I was good at it, and it was enough. And the foundation sent me updates on my father's progress through the same administrative channel it used for all its cases, which was a monthly summary, and I read the summaries with the same attention I gave to all foundation correspondence. And I noted the progress, and I was glad the treatment was working, in the way that I am glad when any foundation case resolves well, which is professionally and without personal weight. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in the 6th month. My assistant brought it to my desk with the morning correspondence, And it was a handwritten envelope, which was unusual enough that I noticed it before I opened anything else. And the handwriting on the envelope was my mother's, and I recognized it the way you recognize something you have not seen for 20 years, which is slowly and then all at once. And I put it to one side and I worked through the rest of the correspondence first, and then I opened it. It was 4 pages long. My mother had written it, and my father had signed the final page beneath her signature. And it was the most complete document I had ever received from either of them, in the sense that it did not contain the language of management or the language of justification, and contained instead the language of people who have arrived somewhere they did not expect to arrive and are trying to describe it accurately. And my mother wrote about the Saturday in October, and she wrote about it in detail. And the detail told me that she had been thinking about it for longer than the 6 months since the walkway, and possibly for longer than I had understood. And she wrote that there was no framing available to her that made what they had done into something other than what it was, and that she had spent a long time looking for that framing and had not found it, and that she was no longer looking. And she wrote that the wing and the plaque and my grandmother's name and my name beneath it had done something to her understanding that she did not have adequate language for, and that she was not going to try to find language for it, and was simply going to say that she was sorry, and that my father was sorry, and that sorry was not sufficient, and they knew it was not sufficient, and they were saying it anyway, because it was what was true. I read all 4 pages. I read them again. I folded the letter along its original folds. I put it in the bottom drawer of my desk. I closed the drawer. I want to be honest with you about what I felt in the minutes after I closed the drawer, because I think honesty about this particular thing matters more than the honesty about any other part of this story. And what I felt was not relief and not satisfaction, and not the specific warmth that people describe feeling when they receive the apology they have been waiting for. And I felt something quieter than any of those things, which was the feeling of a door that has been open for a long time being closed. Not with force, but simply because the reason for its being open no longer existed. And the closing was not dramatic and was not painful and was simply final. And I sat with the finality for a few minutes, and then I went back to work. The following Tuesday, my assistant knocked on my office door. She came in with her tablet, and she said that there was an email that had come through the Foundation's public inquiry portal, and that she was flagging it because the sender's surname matched mine. And I said that I understood, and I asked her to read me the subject line, and the subject line was Grant Application for Small Business Development. And I asked her to read me the sender's name, and the sender's name was Naomi. And I sat with that for a moment, and I thought about a bedroom, and I thought about a bag packed by someone else's hands, and I thought about a bus ticket and 20 pounds folded once, and I thought about a woman in her mid-30s who had watched her parents give her everything and had consumed it and had left when the consumption was complete, and who had now located her sister's foundation through whatever search had led her there, and had written an application email with the specific confidence of a person who believes that the name they share with the foundation's trustee is a door. I said to my assistant that she should send the standard automated response. I said that the response should state that the current application window was closed, and that response times were 4 to 6 weeks, and that all applications were assessed on merit through the standard review process. My assistant said she would send it immediately. I said thank you. She left. I stood up and I walked to the window and I looked at the city, which was doing what it always does in the middle of a Tuesday morning, and I looked at the medical facility in the adjacent building, and I looked at the covered walkway connecting the 2 buildings, and I thought about what I had built, and I thought about how I had built it, and I thought about a pavement in October, and a bus, and a shelter in Harrowfield, and 3 jobs paid in cash, and years of studying, and years of working, and 47 properties and a foundation named for a woman who had held my hand and said she was sorry for what the family had done. And I thought about 20 pounds. 20 pounds did not break me. I want to say that clearly as the final true thing in this account, because I think it is the most important true thing. And the people who put me on that bus had believed that what they were doing was removing a problem, and what they had actually done was remove an anchor. And there is a significant difference between those two things. And the difference is everything I was looking at through that window, and everything that had my name on it, and everything that would continue after this Tuesday was finished. And I was someone who understood by now that the people who abandon you are not taking something from you, and are releasing you from the weight of having to build around them. And I had built without that weight for 20 years, and the building had gone as high as it had gone because there had been nothing pulling it down. I looked at the city. The city did not know everything that had happened in this office in the past 6 months and did not need to know. And the knowing had never been the point, and the point had been the building. And the building was done and was ongoing and was the work of every day that followed. This one silence was never my weakness. It was the condition under which everything I have was made. If you believe that justice was served in this story, then leave a comment below and tell me what part of it stayed with you. Because I read every single one, and the ones that arrive from people who are currently on their own version of that bus, who are somewhere between the pavement and the 14th floor, and who need to know that the distance is crossable, are the ones I carry with me longest. And if you are not yet subscribed to this channel, please do it now. Because every story here is built on the same understanding, which is that the quietest people in the room are often the ones who have already won. And if this gave you something today, a like takes 2 seconds and helps this reach the person who needs to hear it next. And I will see you in the next story.